Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I am delighted to have Stephen Fine, the CEO of Peel Hunt, as my guest. And I've got to know him very well over the last few months and have deep respect for him. And therefore, when I'm looking for inspiring leaders, this leader does have the humility, the humanity, and a nice touch of humor to make him an inspiring leader. Welcome, Stephen. Good to have you on board.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, well, it's great. It's great to have you. And please tell everybody around the world who's listening about Peel Hunt, what it does, and how it helps its clients.
Sure. So Peel Hunt is a roughly 300-person UK-focused mid-market, mid-cap and growth company investment bank. What does that mean? Well, we are retained by, we look after, we advise roughly 150 UK public companies. And to do that, you need to have very, very strong links, not only to those companies, but to their shareholders. So we build a business that has super strong links to companies and shareholders. And through that, you need to write very high quality research. And we write on about 400 public companies. And if you distribute that research, it goes to shareholders. And those shareholders can be quite global in terms of jurisdictional location. So we talk to roughly 1,250 institutional clients around the world about the UK. So we're sort of seen as a UK centre of excellence, a vast repository of intellectual property about what's happening in the UK. And given the makeup of the companies that we look after, they're right in that sort of engine room of growth. The average size of companies that we look after on the public markets is about 900 million sterling. So very solid UK mid-cap and growth engine companies, right at the epicenter of that growth economy that's so needed and so talked about as part of the growth agenda from the UK government. So that's what we do.
Yeah, and before we go into talk about other inspiring leaders that you know, I think this is probably, you just touched on it really, two interesting themes that you raised. One is the Labour government does want growth, which is quite hard at the moment, where some of the decisions that have been made have actually backfired unintentionally, but there have been consequences of that. What do you think they can do to help with growth if you were to try and be an advisor to them? I know they probably wouldn't listen, but maybe if you were advising, what do you think would really help the country and the markets?
Goodness me. Well, I think we only have 60 minutes for this, and I think you'd probably put us out to a Wednesday week if you wanted to go through all of that. I mean, look, first of all, you can't keep saying we want to grow the economy, without doing something. You've got to do something to grow the economy. I think there's been a sense of inertia in this country for quite some time. I think there's been a lot of frustration, I think, over regulation, over bureaucracy, bloated civil service, sort of stifled a lot of creativity. And we've had this overwhelming focus on costs of transactions. And we need to get away from costs and onto growth. And we need to think about risk element and injecting a little bit more risk appetite into the system. There's no shortage of it at all. But it seems that when you get towards the centre of government, that you try and mitigate as much risk as you possibly can, which most definitely acts as a handbrake. So, you know, when you look at the growth versus regulation agenda, it seems to be moving more in the right direction. We all get a bit impatient. We're a bit more short term, but there's definitely a few more things they could do in the immediacy that would make a material difference, while some of these longer term plans like NHS, like planning, pension reform are all bubbling away in the background.
Yeah. So do you think we need our own version of Elon Musk to come and sort out the civil service?
Well, I mean, you've seen already with NHS England as recently as yesterday, being abolished and come under government control. There is definitely a desire to tackle what you might call the bloated nature of the public sector. Now that can work, it can backfire. We're sort of seeing the Elon Musk attitude, and we've talked about burning of red tape and burning of regulations and getting rid of all the quangos, which was talked about in the previous government as well. Easy to say, not so easy to do. I mean, Musk is a bit more blunt, let's say, than maybe what we have over here. But I think the desire to make these changes is definitely there. And an elected government, they did their first budget for a decade or so or more, with a growth agenda, it feels like they want to make some change. So I don't know whether in the period of giving them benefit of the doubt or not, but we're kind of nearly a year into that government. And the budget process wasn't a good one. with rampant speculation. But there are a lot of geopolitical things and global sort of tectonic plates that are shifting that are making things probably slightly harder. But we know for sure they can't do anything more on tax, so you've got to focus on growth. How are you going to do growth? We've got to cut back here, and you've got to cut back there, and you've got to get rid of some red tape, and you've got to make things easier. But you really do have to focus on risk rather than regulation.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very helpful observation. And of course, for the UK markets, the contagion from the shockwaves of what Donald and his, what do you call it, Strategy 2025 backroom team are doing, must have quite big impacts on the uncertainty of the markets and sort of people hanging back from doing perhaps mergers, acquisitions, or investing themselves. Are you seeing that, or are you seeing something different?
Well, it's very weird because things are shifting all the time. We have gone from, let's be candid, a very woke agenda, probably to one of, I think you coined this term earlier with me, one of toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
And that's quite a swing. And that's not an easy thing for anybody, let alone any company, to adapt to quickly. Companies like to be in a position where they can plan, where they have reasonable outlook on where things are going. And if, tariffs on Monday, withdrawn on Tuesday, doubled on Wednesday, halved on Thursday, Gulf on Saturday and Sunday is the sort of US president's view, it's quite difficult to really plan. So I think, and then the sort of brashness of it, part of it you admire because there's things you need to get done. But there are large parts of it where you think, I'm not saying the pendulum always has to swing so far, but there are some part of it you kind of do think when it comes to strength of leadership, there are things that need to be done, and it's very difficult in a center of power to do that. But I think companies are probably welcoming of change, but not in quite the brash way that we're seeing it.
Yeah, and I think it has a knock on. I mean, we saw it with Canada, with Mark Carney and his success, that it's actually rallying good leadership in other countries to counter the toxic masculinity, the age of the strong man, the three Ps of post-truth, populism, and polarization.
Well, you go back to your military background and you can take that SAS phrase, who dares wins. And it kind of feels like we're in a bit of that at the moment. And there's a lot of postulism. There's a lot of, you can call it bullying, you can call it what you like. But it's actually bringing out an inner protectionism from a lot of countries. Funny enough, it could bring a lot of other countries much, much closer together, where they stand together against what they see as a perceived threat. Can also inflame tensions. I think we're in that sort of discovery phase.
Yeah, and I imagine your guys who are writing those reports for different companies, it makes their life, they're really going to have to be on their mettle to keep up with all that's going on. It's quite a big change for them, I imagine, isn't it?
Look, it's very complicated. At the time where we had again, I'll go back to that candid term, the woke agenda, we had a very, very strong investment push for what was called ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And then literally with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that went overnight. You had to be in defense, your homeland security, food security, power security. You need to be in all of those in order to make sure that you're in the right areas. And that meant fossil fuels and defense and things that you wouldn't normally have looked at. So boom, an entire thesis effectively went out the window for reasons that were probably quite rational.
Yeah. But that must be very interesting for you as a CEO of Peel Hunt. You're respected, I know, having talked to many people who know you and work with you, by the breadth of the people you know and your curiosity with what's going on in the world. How do you keep abreast of all that's going on so that you are able to speak with ease to so many different groups of people about what's happening?
Jack of all trades, master of none. Very good, excuse my language, bullshitting your way through. No, that's not the case. I think I'm probably a lover of information, and I'd rather know and be on an email distribution list than not, and read it in the paper the day after. I'm definitely a people person. I like wandering around. We have a big dealing room. That's very, I suppose if I just step back a little bit, we're advising companies, you need to have a 3 to 5 year view. We're writing research on companies, you need to have a 1 to 3 year view. We're dealing with fund managers, you need to have a sort of 1 month to a 1 year view. We're executing orders, that's a day to a week view. And we're trading in markets, that's a sort of 2 second view. So all these inputs are complicated, and making that work is complicated in itself. But it does give you a very, very broad set of inputs on what's going on. There's the here and now, and there's the long term. And I do believe in life and in business, you have to have a long-term view. You have to see through the here and now.
Yeah. No, that's very wise. And you've also come across a number of the leaders who also have that kind of view. And you and I were talking about people that you found inspiring. I think you had one that you wanted to give a call out for, but I'd be interested in some of the themes, because you meet 150 different CEOs of the different companies and many more. What themes you're seeing among that group? But firstly, who do you want to give a shout out for, and what qualities do you find?
Well, I have to give a big shout out to a chap I've worked with probably almost every single day of my working life in some other exec or non-exec capacity. It's a chap called Darren Carter, who I worked with at a very aggressive sales and trading house from 1987 to 1993, and then he asked me to come and work with him to build a brokerage business from scratch for a big US hedge fund called D. Shaw in '93, which we grew through to 1998. But I think sometimes in life, you sort of look around at people. I noticed this at school and at college. Who do you think is going to be good? Who isn't? You kind of have a view, and you generally prove right. But I'm not saying hanging on the coattails, but looking at how certain people act and conduct themselves, and the way they run or manage or deal with multiple inputs across a huge variety of areas. You sort of think, yeah, okay, I kind of quite like that. And I'm not saying you model yourself exactly the same way, but you see characteristics and styles that you admire, and you think you want to be part of your own makeup as well.
No, it's nice. And what about the themes that you're seeing? You're seeing a whole broad range of CEOs of different organizations. I want the light and the dark side. What do you see?
No, there definitely is. There is a light and a dark side, because
both.
We act for mid-cap and growth companies, and nothing ever moves in a straight line. Everybody's 45-degree business plan for growth, it gets pushed out a year, then another year, and then it doesn't become a 45-degree line. It becomes a bit of a W or whatever it might be. And you have to adapt. So I think from our perspective as well, when we're acting for companies in the field of offering advice and being a trusted advisor, you can have a good spread. We love working with founders, entrepreneurial founders that have got significant skin in the game. We love working with established companies that have got a great growth agenda, very established, been around for 20, 30, 40 years. We like working with companies. Like is probably the wrong word. We find it a challenge that we relish in with companies that have found themselves in trouble and need our help. And those are areas where we feel we can put our shoulder to the wheel and really be that trusted advisor and guide them through the difficult periods they're having. So, from that perspective, there's light and there's dark. And, we know as sure as day follows night, things never move in a straight line. So you've got to be able to help in all circumstances.
And in your experience over these many years that you've been in this line of business, how important do you think the quality of the leader is? I know it's not about one person, it's about the team they get around them, but can you spot a good leadership team and a good CEO, and can you see a direct correlation with how it performs financially?
Yes. And I mean, there have been vast amounts of academic work on this subject and what makes a good CEO, and why is a good CEO good in one business and not good in another. Why do you promote your very best producers to be managers and then watch them fail because they can't produce anymore and they lose their purpose and they don't really know how to manage? So, there's an awful lot on that. So, I don't think I have any sort of great secret weapon or recipe for success, but I think, when you meet a good CEO or when you meet a CEO, you can tell quite quickly how engaged they are, how ambitious they are, how they handle all the various different stakeholders they have to deal with, because stakeholder management is a big part of life as a CEO. Whether it's your board, your regulators, your staff, your employees, your managers, whoever, your customers, etc. These are all really important inputs, and you can sort of see why some succeed and others find it a little bit harder.
Yeah, and it is interesting. You touched something I saw in my 20 years in the military, and I've also seen in my 25 years in business, that you have some who are naturally leaders and others who, as you say, are great producers. Sometimes you can have some who are leaders and producers, player managers almost. I like to think I was a pretty good player manager when I was running when I was managing director of a PLC on board executive coaching. I liked to do the delivery, but I also liked to lead the team. Maybe they would have thought I wasn't so good. I'm not sure if I chat to them all. But we had an expression, NANP, not allowed near people, that some people are really good at producing, or as a specialist, a technical guy, CTO, whatever it might be, but please don't give them a team to lead, because they might be unintentionally on the autism spectrum, and they just say things as they are, and people get very offended, whatever it might be. Though there are strengths of autism, because I've seen some very successful people with their knowledge in a depth that no one else has. But what's your view on that?
Well, look, it's not the same as the military, but there are some analogies. But carrying the people is obviously vital, because you want to be, you're looking after people, you're looking after their livelihoods, they're looking after effectively their families and their hopes, their aspirations, and their dreams, and that's difficult. And they need to believe that your vision and the strategy of the firm is something they want to be a part of. And the way I've looked at things is, I don't really want to tell people what time they need to be in or what time they need to go home, but they kind of want to be there because they might miss something. And that becomes very powerful and self-fueling. The other thing I've always looked at is you want to give people a career and not a job. They're both the same, but they're radically different. And you don't want, anyone can sort of come in, do their day's work, go home, kick the dog, or be frustrated or whatever. But you want people coming in to be a part of what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And in all parts of the cycle, having them, working and believing in the same vision is important, because you want them backing you in the tough times as well as the good. It's much harder in the tough times, as we all know.
It is. And your Glassdoor reviews for Peel Hunt are very good. And when I sort of did my research before we started to work together, the culture was seen and a high level of trust and a psychologically safe but high performing business. How did you get to that place to create that kind of business? Tell me your origin story. What led Stephen Fine to become the leader you are today with a good team around you? How did you grow up? Who influenced you? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, family was a very big influence. My father was quite entrepreneurial. The family business from his grandfather was a jewelers and pawnbrokers. And he branched out into, would you believe, car hire, car sales and property development from there. So quite entrepreneurial father. But always the chat around the table was business and business focused. And, I'd sit around, I've got two younger brothers, one 2 years younger than me, one 8 years younger than me. But that was always the topic of conversation. It wasn't really about fashion or music or whatever. We kind of got into that ourselves, but that was the topic. And then Saturday job very early, very strong encouragement to be independent and to think for yourselves and look after yourselves. Saturday job in the pawnbroking shop was fascinating because it was opposite of bookmakers, which was probably the perfect location. Saturday job at a light shop for about 5 years, where I was sort of expert in 3-arm or 5-arm chandeliers and, Edison screw or bayonet cap light bulbs. I mean, I'm amazed I can even remember what they are. But that again was an encouragement: earn your own money and be independent. And then weirdly, the dream, because my father's best friend, my late father's best friend, was his accountant. And again, that sort of reinforced the whole business view. So originally my dream, this is in the early mid-80s, was to qualify as an accountant and get into corporate finance, because you read in the papers at the time, because there were no tablets or mobile phones or whatever, about these corporate raiders. And it was the likes of Carl Icahn and T. Boone Pickens, and it was asset stripping. It was like, wow, that sounds great, brilliant. I'm going to do that. So let's qualify as an accountant. So I did my degree in accountancy, and then I made the mistake, which actually wasn't a mistake, of working in a firm of accountants for 3 weeks one summer, where I grew up, which is in Southend-on-Sea. Great place when the sun's out and the tide's in. I worked there for 3 weeks one summer, and it absolutely destroyed any interest I had in the profession. Not because the profession isn't a good one, but because I sort of spent a week doing a market trader's bank reconciliation and sort of ticking off bank statements and checkbook stubs at this. And I thought, I can't do this. But at the same time, Big Bang had happened, the big deregulatory Big Bang in the city in 1986. And I was looking around at friends of mine who left school at age 18, and they were driving around in TVRs, which was a great car then, and living in Belsize Park or whatever. I thought, wow, what am I doing? I've got to give this a go. So I thought, what, I'm going to give it a go. And if it doesn't work, my degree's taking me to sort of professional level 1 exams, so I can always go back to that. Or maybe I can do an MBA instead or something. So I wrote off the obligatory 50 letters, and I had 4 interviews. And from that, I was offered 2 jobs. One was to be a foreign exchange dealer. And I just thought, that sort of white socks and spider's web tattoos and this sort of thing. No disrespect to foreign exchange traders, but in the early mid-80s, that's probably not a million miles away. And the other one sounded very exotic. It was to be a Japanese warrant trader. And I thought, that sounds interesting. And the firm I interviewed at seemed very forward-thinking and quite punchy. It was very sales and trading focused. And I took that job, and it was fascinating. It was 3 months before the Wall Street crash. And when the Wall Street crash happened, I thought, oh, goodness me, world's ended for financial services. I've just started. I'll probably have to disappear off. But then the Japanese market powered on for the next 2 years to an unbelievably stratospheric heights. And we were trading long-dated call options on Japanese stocks that only ever went up. And it was like, well, this is just fantastic. And it was a very, very aggressive sales and trading house. And that's where I first met Darren. But I had a wonderful opportunity. I started there in 87, had a wonderful opportunity in 1989 to go and live and work in New York. And I went over there, young, single, British accent in America, living on expenses. Those were the days. And it was terrific. New York then was a little bit more edgy before it cleaned itself up, but had a wonderful experience. Came back in 91. And then had some dark times because the Japanese market decided the best way to move would be to go down for the next 15 years or so.
Wow.
And it became quite challenging, very difficult. And I questioned, should I be in the industry? Should I not? And then I think I mentioned earlier, my colleague said, look, we've got a really good opportunity to set up a brokerage business from scratch for this US hedge fund called D.E. Shaw, very famous US hedge fund. And I'd like you to come with me. And I jumped at the chance. And I was 27. Mm-hmm. He was same age. And here you go. You're backed by a big US hedge fund. And at the time, interestingly, they had world-class, they still do, but world-class technology. And this was before Windows 95 had even come along. So suddenly aggressive sales and trading allied to that world-class technology, building a business while others were probably more in decline. We built a global equity-linked products business, Tokyo, Hong Kong, London, New York, all around equity derivatives, but in particular convertible bonds. And convertible bonds in the 1990s, they were the product that gave birth to the big multi-strategy hedge funds that still exist and are powerhouses of the world right now. So we were right in the epicenter. And then next stage of my career was, unfortunately, there was I think those that are old enough to remember, there was a hedge fund crisis in 1998. A company called Long-Term Capital Management lost 98% of its capital base. And our hedge fund D.E. Shaw had a nowhere near as bad an experience, but they had a difficult experience, and they were linked up with Bank of America. And our independently profitable brokerage business that we'd built for them was put up for sale. D.E. Shaw as a hedge fund went on to achieve enormous success, but our brokerage business was put up for sale in that difficult time. And I had a severance agreement on my desk, and I had 3 kids, and I'm thinking, gosh, this is not a great, situation. But we sold that business to the Belgian bank KBC and became their financial products group, KBC Financial Products. So that evolution in terms of how we worked was aggressive sales and trading at the first business, world-class technology, and then you're in a bank and you have a balance sheet. So suddenly that was a very good progression, and it allowed us to do some fantastic things in a very welcoming financial services environment. And I was still retaining my expertise in Japan and Asia, particularly Japan. I was traveling out there 4 or 5 times a year, etc. And then again, sorry, keep going with it as the career path, but I then built a cash equity business in Japan, which was also fascinating because all the derivative business we were doing allowed us to be a huge transactor in equities. And then a real transformational time came when the British company Cazenove shut down their Japanese equity business completely. And we thought that was an amazing opportunity to really make our mark in the world of cash equities in Japan. And I took on, a whole host of people, Tokyo, London, and New York, to really put us in the world of cash equities. And that, moving forward to my Peel Hunt times, was really the introduction to me on how to run and manage relationships and corporate knowledge in the world of cash equities, because that was very deep, very intense, very knowledgeable, incredible relationships with their clients and the companies they were talking about. So that grew, and I actually moved out to Japan in 2005 and 2006. This time I wasn't single, but I was married with my 3 children and the pet dog. And it was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, a wonderful experience. There's a big difference between a business trip and living. You go to Narita Airport, go to the hotel, and then the office, then dinner in the hotel, and the office, dinner, airport, and home. And then living there is quite radically different. And we had a wonderful time. Kids cried on the way out. They sobbed on the way back because they loved it as well. But the reason for coming back, roundabout way getting to where I am right now, was that my boss in Brussels called me and said, look, we also own this UK business called Peel Hunt. And at the time, the fellow running it resigned to join one of the Icelandic banks. And I think those of you can remember before the financial crisis, Iceland was going to rule the world. Small country, 300,000 people, suddenly, running everything. What I consider coming back, I seem to know what equities were, and it's a chance to integrate it. So, I came back and I found this wonderful company called Peel Hunt that was owned by the bank. Quite sleepy, no real technology implementation, no sort of outward focus, quite inward, looked after a lot of very little companies. And I thought there's something you can do here. And that's why I decided to come back from Japan and then properly integrate this business called Peel Hunt into the broader KBC environment, which I did for a couple of years. And then, of course, the global financial crisis happened. And I suddenly thought to myself, well, look, you've got this really interesting UK business that we're trying to do quite a lot with. And I'd spent quite a bit of KBC's time and money on improving it. And KBC is a Belgian bank, and this is a UK corporate advisory firm. Post GFC, are they really the right owner? Maybe there's an opportunity to take what was an independent company that IPO'd and bought by a bank back into independent hands. And so it then became front of mind for me, is there a chance to lead a management and staff buyout of this business from the bank? But I couldn't make that decision. The bank had to make that decision, and banks are notoriously slower in some aspects. But once they make decisions, they then want to sort of get on with it. But I guess from the summer of 2008, when the crisis was raging, it wasn't really until August 2009 where I was summoned to Brussels and, to use the classic phrase, earmarked for divestment. And that led to me having to sit one side of the table and execute my fiduciary duty to market the business in good faith, whilst at the same time sit the other side of the table trying to buy it as cheaply as possible. So that was an interesting juxtaposition, and again, a fascinating new education for me and the management team, which I really enjoyed. Complicated, cumbersome, banks after the crisis became very process driven, but got it done. And we ended up acquiring the business. It completed at the end of November 2010, where myself and a group of management underwrote the staff portion of a buyout of the bank, of the business from the bank. And we were backed by friends of the firm, including this chap I mentioned earlier, Darren Carter, who formed an investor group who backed us. And the great thing is that they backed us for 9 years with no call on their money. And, I'm not being funny, but that was actually tremendous for a financial services business, corporate advisory business that wanted to have a long-term view. And I can't emphasize that point enough. If you want to build a long-term franchise business, you cannot be owned, for example, by private equity because you've got a for sale sign above your door. You've got to have that long-term view and not be transaction driven. that means you've got to focus on your clients. And I think we used the phrase at the time, it'll be a get rich slow strategy. So that's how we started off Peel Hunt, and then the rest, and I can go into a bit of detail about what we've done since then, as you say, is history.
Yeah, well, that's a fabulous story. And one of the themes that comes up as I've got to know you from people I've spoken to is the family focus. Both as you were growing up, bringing up other members of your family, but also the relationship you and your wife have is something that everybody loves to see. And the fact that you really care about family. And now you've got 3 or 4 grandchildren?
4.
Tell me about family and how important it is to you, and how that helps you as a person.
Yeah, it's enormously important. You know, the cliche "happy wife, happy life" is very important. But you know, I've been married coming up for 33 years. I've got 3 wonderful kids. They're 29, 30, and 32. Girl, boy, girl. Both of my girls are married with 2 children each, and my son's living with his girlfriend. They're quite close by us. We're a very close family. We've always had it that way. Slightly different to the sort of independence I talked about when I was growing up. My parents had a holiday home in South Florida. They would go over there and spend some time there. I'd be at home with my brothers. You know, it might have been for a few weeks or a couple of months at a time, but you're sort of then left to yourself to get on with things. That also teaches you a lot. But in a weird way, you know, they were absolutely devoted to each other. There's nothing my dad wouldn't do for my mum, and vice versa. And that strong family bond flowed through. The slight difference was, you know, I want everyone near me. I don't want everyone near me. I want them to get on with their lives, and if they go and live in the other side of the world, that's fine. But to me, it's being a big part of your family's life is really important to me. Now, I know some people, the relentless drive to push the business forward, there's always a sacrifice, there's always a compromise. But I've always said, look, if there's a sports day, if there's a nativity play, if there's a kid's reception or something, I'd rather you go there and see it, because you don't get a chance to live that life again. And, you know, whilst it's true that no one on their deathbed ever said, I wish I'd spent more time in the office, you know, I think family life is a really important part of the balance you need to have in what you do.
I can't celebrate that more, because time and again, a lot of people, the rhetoric doesn't match the reality, but in your case, you lead by example. I was speaking to General Himalaya Thapa from Nepal, who he and I were at Santos 43 years ago. That really ages me. But his general, who was in charge of the army during the Maoist rebellion they had in Nepal, he didn't take holiday for 3 years. Now, that was seen as a great thing, but actually there comes a cost to the family at some stage. And people who've gone on operational tours with special forces, and they go and give their whole time. You know, one lady I had on the podcast, 10 tours of Afghanistan as a staff sergeant in the edge of the Chinook, or mounting the door gun, but PTSD followed. So I think the fact you are getting family right, and you encourage others in the company to, as long as they come back and get their day job done, work is an activity, not a time or a place. And so when you get the work done and you achieve the results and you make the sale, that's good enough. So it's lovely to hear you do that. You've already talked a bit about dark moments. I was interested, you talked about the 98, 99 hedge fund crisis. But in all these different difficult times that you had in what is a fascinating career, what did you learn from things like that? You know, I think you said in 92, 93, you were worrying, you know, were you in the right job? And then the hedge fund. But what did you learn from these potential setbacks or difficult times that shaped your leadership now?
I've got a very nice anecdote that I'm stepping back a little bit here, but I vividly remember once we had to do, this was when I was at DE Shaw, we had to do this sort of self-analysis as part of your annual review. And, you know, you've got to grade yourself. And I remember going home and saying to my lovely wife, Jacqueline, you know, I had to do this thing for the first time. She said, "Oh, what did you do?" So I said, "Yeah, no, it's been a bit of a difficult year." And, you know, I gave myself 6 out of 10. And she looked at me, okay, with daggers. And it was a real seminal moment in my life, actually. it was almost like she'd slapped me around the face and said, "You stupid cretin." Okay, sorry to use bad language. Why on earth would you give yourself 6 out of 10? And I was like, well, I was trying to be honest, and this is difficult. She says, well, you're not a 6 out. You're not. And I said, well, no, maybe you're right. And it sort of made me reflect. There's a self-confidence element to things, and I think it moves on to leadership, where confidence is important. Misplaced confidence is disastrous, absolutely disastrous. But confidence, particularly in the face of adversity, in your own capability and in your team, I think are quite important, because it then means you've got the backbone or the strength to at least try and get through things, rather than sort of rolling over and have your belly tickled. But actually not accepting that you're 5, 6 out of 10, because from a self-belief perspective, you're better than that and you can get through it. And I love a challenge. I'm quite competitive. I think most people know that you want to make a success of everything you do. So, I'll probably sort of throw that in there.
That's good learning. And I think someone described it as, we're always work in progress. We're an imperfect masterpiece.
Yeah.
And I do find in financial services, which I've worked in for many years, that to find a leader who gets it about right with a humility, humanity, humor, and a nice bit of quiet self-confidence and wisdom, sometimes quite rare. There's too many who are very cocky and very pleased with the fact that they are very wealthy and look down on others. So actually, to get it right, it takes some work. How about, you've got your children, 29, 30, 32, that sort of age, and your grandchildren. But if you went back to give your grandchildren, when they get to the age of 16 to 18, a bit of advice based on your years of experience, what would you say this matters and this doesn't? Bit of advice to your grandchildren from your experience.
Well, I'm a great believer in you've got to make sure, for as much as you possibly can, you have options. So you're not backed into a corner. I think that's very important. And also, I think it's just as important to find out what you don't want to do as it is to find out what you do want to do. So, have a look around. Don't feel like if you take a job that you've got to be there for 20, 30 years. I know generationally that's all changed anyway, but actually you've got to be prepared to give it a go. You've got to try. You've got to find out what you don't like as well as what you do like. But I think, don't give up at the first hurdle. There's always challenges. I mean, we're chucking out a lot of cliches here, but I think part of that is quite valuable advice.
Yeah.
But again, don't get yourself in a situation where you have no choice. You're stuck. And I think for as long as you can is always important.
I think that's a great bit of advice. And even when a leader is just starting the coach approach to leadership, we'll talk about your leadership style shortly. The coach approach to leadership sometimes uses a very basic T-GROW model. What's the topic when they come to you and see you and they ask you, Stephen, what should I do? It's very easy for you just to tell them, give them the fish, but not teach them to fish. But the teach them to fish approach, what's the topic? What's the goal in 5 minutes time? What are the options? Well, there's only one option. No. That's a decision. That's not an option. If you've got 3 options, what would they be? Oh, well, there'd be this and this. Okay.
Yes.
Which option would you bet your career on? What? Yeah. Which option would you bet your career on? Well, option 3. Well, can I suggest another one? Yeah. Okay. Option 4. And can you build on that? Yeah, there's an option 5. Which one do you go for now? I'd go for option 5. Okay. And then the O, the W, what are you willing to do? What's your plan? Who, where, when, what, how? And I think leaders that don't just tell, and that's becoming the sort of cultural way now with presidential executive orders and everybody seeming to think toxic masculinity and just might is right and spheres of influence. They think this is the way ahead now, that, a culture where you coach other people to think for themselves is out. I'm sure that will not last long. It won't work well. You'll get some results, but it's not sustainable. But I'm just interested, moving on from that, how's your leadership style evolved since you took over in 2016 at Peel Hunt and before that, and the lessons that you've learned from it and how you've changed your leadership style over the years?
I mean, I'm often asked what's your leadership style. I sort of summarize it colloquially as sort of dictatorship by consensus, which kind of throws up some weird order. What's he banging on about? Because I kind of have a very, very clear view on where I think we're going and what we need to do. I need to carry the people, so I need to get them on side with it. So it's not getting your own way by forcing other people to believe in you. It's either validating in your mind or your senior manager's minds that strategy is right through collective belief, and then you get there, and you carry the people. So we were asked before, a few years back about what's the purpose of the company, and purpose was a big byword at the time, and I was always a big skeptic, and it's save the world, peace for all humankind, this sort of thing as your purpose is, and you could take the same purpose and apply it across a number of different organizations and it wouldn't make much difference. But I became a convert because we ended up with guiding and nurturing people through the evolution of business. And when I first, having done the exercise and worked with an external consultant and looked at how we should frame this and taken all the inputs, it was really interesting because that word nurturing was so absent from financial services. It was always hard charging, aggressive, big bank mentality, steamrolling, fees, pay, whatever you'd think of. And nurturing was like a million miles away from where corporates were looking at things. Even your corporate client base, I don't want to be nurturing, really. But the more you looked at it, the more you found that actually this is what people were looking for and looking at. And the more you looked at it as well, the more it fitted with how you operate. So it's not a nannying nurturing, it's kind of helping and guiding. And that evolution of business part was also really important because I think it captured everything we want to do with our advisory business. That, every large company started as a small company. Okay, that's a known fact. But you don't want to act for a small company that gets to a certain size and then dispenses with your services and moves on to a big bank. You want to grow with your clients. So that evolution of business is not just watching your clients evolve and grow. You've got to keep pace and you've got to do the same thing. So how do you do that? What do they want? What's missing? How do you genuinely be the trusted advisor? How do you genuinely cover broader, deeper distribution in different geographical parts of the world or jurisdictions? How do you deal with a regulatory environment that was getting tougher and tougher? How do you execute or transact or trade on markets where costs are going up and margins are coming down? But you want to offer all things to all people. So all of that evolution of business is not just your client side; it's you as well, and how you tackle that.
Yeah, and that nicely leads on. I am very keen on people living their life on purpose and their organizations rather than being off purpose. And so if your purpose is guiding and nurturing people through the evolution of business, that does have a true ring and it's relevant for you. And it isn't something you can lift and drop into another company.
No.
It's too many of the mission statements or purpose or vision statements are so anodyne. They mean nothing. I remember seeing in a number of banks things that were on the walls and the people weren't behaving that way at all. But talking about guiding and nurturing people, you've been instrumental in the non-executive director awards. The role of a NED, when you look at good non-executive directors, what makes a good non-executive director?
Well, look, the classic governance words of governance, stewardship, oversight, best practice, all very important. But the key word is challenge. And again, there is a huge amount of academic literature on what makes a good non-exec. But there's a human relationship, there's an understanding and a knowledge. The sort of cliche is you're in this sort of giant sort of tower building, and these non-exec sort of helicopter lands on the roof, and they come down to the top floor, have a chat for 2 hours, and then get back in the helicopter and go off. They never see anything below. It's something you need to work hard on, and having a board that understands the business and the makeup of the board is really important. Areas of specialization, risk, audit, are really important. Remuneration, all of those things are really important. What do we absolutely have to do, and what do we only really need to do? But if we don't, it's not the end of the world. Yeah. But I think probably more importantly, it's that relationship between the board and the execs that's supportive, nurturing as well, understanding. They're guiding you and you're helping them understand. It's symbiotic, it's two-way. And, I think I'm very fortunate that we founded the Non-Exec Director Awards with the Sunday Times back in 2006, 20th anniversary next year. And that's been a massive education for me as well, because it's opened my eyes to a lot of the transformation that's taken place in the boardroom, because we have a judging panel, and that's had to deal with all of the changes that have happened, the global financial crisis, the rise of regulation, the frustrations with remuneration, the stewardship code, the excessive regulation, all of those things, and then not least of which diversity, where there's been a huge push to change structure and makeup. And I think actually from a judging panel, we were actually way ahead in how we changed the makeup of our judging panel to keep us ahead of what was happening in UK boardrooms.
It's been quite interesting talking to some of your fellow panelists from the Non-Executive Director Awards. And in my own experience over the last 20, 30 years, when I've been talking to CEOs or interviewing non-executive directors, there's quite a friction between the two sides. The CEO feels they're attacking him or her. Normally it's a him feeling they're attacking him, and they get very defensive. And then other people lower down sometimes feel the non-executive directors do land on the roof of the very tall tower, and they have no idea what's going down in the basement, or even a couple of floors down, -1, -2. And they just come, take the money and go. But for the non-executive directors, there's always the problem that a number of them haven't made the mental shift. They go, well, I've been a CEO before, so I know what to do. And they almost come in as a quasi-CEO and try and do the CEO's job for them, or the chairman isn't a non-executive chairman, they're an executive chairman. And some unashamedly say they are. So, for example, interviewing Archie Norman, who's been very successful, he sees himself as M&S's executive chairman, even though it's a non-executive role. So they do value that sometimes, both sides. I just wonder what your view is on those kind of things I've experienced.
Look, I think you're either an exec chair, in which case you have defined responsibilities, or you're a chair and you are non-exec. And the execs run the business, and the agreed strategy that's discussed at the board level and devolved down for the execs to execute is important. But the board could also be a sounding board, a sounding board. It's a board, it's a sounding board. And I think that chair CEO relationship is really important. Lucinda is my boss as chair of Peel Hunt, and I think we have a very good relationship. Talk about all sorts of things, and she'll be tough on me in certain areas, but she's amazingly supportive of what we're trying to do. And then you also see how chairs work in action through the NED Awards. Again, a nice anecdote. Someone else who I have tremendous respect for, a proper boardroom heavyweight, was Sir Roger Carr.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And he was chair of our judging panel. And it's quite a nice story. We introduced this new category of Lifetime Achievement Award, which would be a judges award. This is not general public making recommendations. This was the 17 judges collectively nominating an individual or recognizing someone for their lifetime achievement in governance. And, I too often got 17 judges to come up with their thoughts and ideas, thinking we'd probably have 5 or 6 naming the same person. And we have 17 individual recommendations from 17 individual judges. And I went to Sir Roger and said, God, how are we going to deal with this one? Because when he got sort of 15, 20 minutes to decide, and he said, Stephen, leave it to me. And it was sort of, again, I'll go back to what I've said, dictatorship by consensus. He basically got everybody in the room to agree on the right person. Let me be very clear, on the right person, just through the way he handled the people around the table. So, these 9, it's not lifetime or whatever. So now we're down to 8. And of these 8, I can probably see these 4, and then we're down to 4. And of the 4, and everyone nodding, and there was virtually no dissent, a couple of questions, and boom, it was done. Yeah. So, you can see how these things can happen, but that's a nice little anecdote.
No, it is a nice anecdote, Sir Roger Carr. And also that takes me on to sort of cultural leadership, both in Glassdoor and reviews of your organization by external people or people who've worked there. The emphasis is a collegiate environment and ethical standards. Now, I know for the cynics out there listening, financial services and ethics, they don't go together. It's like, estate agents and ethics.
Yeah.
Having had two daughters, both being lied to by estate agents, I'm very wary of that. So those are very important to you. How have you shaped that, and how have you adapted to the future changes that are going on? Because it's going to be different. You've got working from home and things like that. So the environment, the culture is always adapting. But how are you adapting? Is it still the same?
Yeah, look, culture can eat strategy.
Yeah.
It just can. So you got to, if you get the culture right, you'll be okay. And I think, or you got a better chance. If I'm critical, if I'm criticized, it's probably for giving individuals too much of the benefit of the doubt, or too long an opportunity to demonstrate their capability.
Mm-hmm.
And I often wrestle with, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because some big part of my life is treat people how you'd like to be treated yourself. And the sort of hire and fire and chopping people off at their knees and putting their heads on spikes in the Broadgate circle, to me, is not a way to run a business. You'll get so far, and then your culture will be so awful that people will just, up sticks at the first sign of a downturn.
Yeah.
So again, it goes back to carrying the people, and the culture is important. Now, what does that mean? It means being a people person. It means listening. It means being empathetic. It means working on making it a great environment in which to work. It means helping people understand what each other does. Because I think sometimes, and I go back to what I said earlier, if you've got a 3 to 5 year view on a trusted advisory relationship and a 2-second view on a market trader, they're going to have very, very different views on what hard work is, and attitude and intensity, because it's a totally different comparison. If you ask one of my market makers, what do you think of our investment bankers? They'll say, well, they get in late. They're not in at 6:30 in the morning. They're, they might get in at 8, but they'll stay till midnight. It's a very different attitude. So again, going back to what I said at the beginning about those timeframes and making that work well, a big part of that is getting the different areas of the firm to better understand what each other does. Communication is absolutely key. As much transparency as you can give without shooting yourself in the foot, because you can do that if you're too transparent. And that sort of nurturing attitude, giving people a career, to me that's all it adds up to.
Yeah, and I am taken by all that you say there, and I was thinking of one of the other guests, and she was saying, I think it was the CEO of Wolf Olins, Sarah Ashman. She said as she was brought up on treat others as you'd like to be treated, but then her own experience was to modify that, which was to treat others as they would like to be treated. Because actually not everybody's like you. A bit like you're saying there with the deal makers and the investment bankers do want to be treated slightly different. I mean, there's a strong sense of fairness, which goes back to Stone Age times, that if we detect any slight fairness, I think there was some test done on the monkeys, wasn't there? There's little monkeys that are so related to the bonobos, where
Yes.
they give them a cucumber, and they're all given a cucumber for doing some small task, and they're given a cucumber. And then one of them is given a cucumber and the other one's given a grape. Now the grape has much more currency for them because it's so nice for them. The others just stopped. They wouldn't play. The ones who were given the cucumbers. This is not fair. Yeah. And so I'm sure with the culture that you have, the thing like bonuses and things like that is often a very contentious issue when people feel fairness, but actually treating... So it's a paradox. Treating everybody the same is the right thing to do for fairness, but treat others as they would like to be treated, what works for them. How do you balance that paradox out? Because I do think...
No, look, we've had that same issue with working from home.
Yeah.
Now, I think we all lived through a momentous time, a tragic time, but a momentous time with a couple of lockdowns during the 2021 period, and everyone worked from home. And I think everyone was surprised at how well that worked. and how we were able to, deal with it. And everyone was mad busy because, particularly in financial services, everything was happening. And the fact that financial markets stayed open and you couldn't go to a casino or bet on a horse race or a football match or whatever it might be, and stock prices were winging around all over the place, and the crypto, whatever it was, there was no shortage of things to do, and animal spirits came roaring through. But of course it changed, and then the office is where you act better, and the phrase "better together" is important. But I looked at it slightly differently, and I got a third party to come in and do a sort of full analysis, or a culture jam, we called it, where everyone in the whole firm was invited to participate. It was up to them if they decided to or not. And the sole topic was the future of the way we work. And there were 5 different meetings, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You could all join one if you wanted to, any of those. And we ended up with about 120, 300 odd people participating. It was not a bad turnout. But everything was on the table. Living at work is the same as working from home. Presenteeism, everything was in there. Someone sitting next to you with their headphones on, talking really loudly. Wouldn't you rather be at home if you want to write a big research report? Isn't it easier when you've got no distractions? It all came out. It's work, so why can't we keep doing it? And what we realised very quickly was that actually one size fits all, and I think this goes back to the timings that we've talked about before, doesn't really work for the firm. So we should have some guiding principles for the whole firm, and then rules by department, where the managers could impose their rules so long as they were within the principles of the firm. So the 3 principles were very simply more in than out. Now, I did have some people say, is that 111 out of 220 days? Of course, the answer to that was, well, no. It's sort of on a weekly basis. Principle number 2 was the client comes first. So if they want you 7 days a week, that's what you got to do. And then the third principle, which was the corollary of it's not all about you, because you couldn't really say that, it's think about your team. And if you've got new starters or if you've got juniors, and it's assimilation to the culture, mentoring, that sort of thing, think about your team. So that got us pretty much to 3 days a week across the whole firm. Now, I've changed that as of February the 1st this year to make it 4 days mandatory, with a day working from home, which typically is a Friday. So, I look outside the office here today and it's kind of Gobi Desert, not much around. We still have a hardcore that will come in every day. But 4 days, to me, it's just under the auspices of better together. And, financial services have had a tough time the last 3 years. And our business has never been in better shape in terms of the client base and the reach and the footprint and the brand and everything that's going on. Numbers are probably slightly different story because it's quite challenging, but better together. And if you want to come out of this with a bang rather than a whimper, you kind of got to be in it together. So push that, and I think from a cultural perspective, that's how we've taken it.
Fantastic. Well, Stephen, we're now at the point where I'd love you to introduce yourself, say where you work and what your company does, and give us your top tip to finish off.
So I'm Stephen Fine. I'm Chief Executive of Peel Hunt. We're a UK mid-cap and growth company focused corporate advisor and trading house, roughly 300 people. I think my key points are you need to have a career and not a job. That helps frame the culture. Culture does eat strategy. That's academically proven. But advice will be, listen, give people time. You can be impulsive, but I think you've got to be commercial around the impulsivity. But it's all about the people. Carry the people.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, Stephen, look, good luck in continuing to lead Peel Hunt through tough times in the UK markets. But I think if anybody's going to come through strongly, Peel Hunt will do. You've got a market leading position. But thank you for sharing your life experiences, your wisdom and experience with people around the world.
Thank you very much.